Hey everybody, Coach Toolshed here, and in today's video, I'd like to discuss some of the self-perpetuating issues that the gaming industry has created for itself and how their recent cries of poverty are really ringing pretty hollow when you consider that everything they've done over the past decade has set themselves up to get into the position that they are in now, and now they're trying to pawn off those problems onto the customers. Now, while this is not exactly anything that is unexpected, anyone who's been following the industry for a while has no doubt noticed that we were headed down the road where they were saying all along that they were going to be starting to increase pricing, and so this is not coming as any surprise that we saw this week where 2K Games came out and announced that the upgraded version of the next NBA 2K game is going to be $70 baseline on the next generation consoles. So a lot of people have speculated, and I believe rightly so, that when new games are coming out on the next generation consoles, we might be seeing a $70 baseline price tag as opposed to the $60 price that we've been seeing for the past couple of console generations. While I think that there is probably a lot of merit to that, I want to discuss some of the excuses being made by the gaming industry and discuss why it's really not anything to do with increased prices of games that is the issue and why they're not making any more money. It's really their own problem with their development processes that is happening and why they're now crying poverty and, oh, dev increases, oh, the costs are going up, oh, they double every generation. Well, that's really a problem with what they're doing and how they're running their own businesses. And that's what I want to discuss today, because a lot of this just rings entirely hollow if you really break down what they've done to themselves over the past decade. So one thing that really caught my eye when I was reading through the press statement that 2K put out regarding the price increase that we're going to be seeing for the game in the next generation, something that stuck out was when they said that because the game is going to run smoother and faster than ever before, that obviously that's going to lead to increased development costs and everything else. And it got to thinking that that directly contradicts everything else that we've heard coming from developers and publishers regarding, the architecture of the PS5 and how everyone's been saying that this console is so much easier to develop for than ever before, and that compared to the PS4, developers are going to have a lot easier time developing for this console. So just got me wondering, we already know that we've seen with the tech breakdown that the console itself is going to allow for faster loading speeds in general. So how is that something that's going to cause increased development time or increased cost? See, the problem is, and what we see, this is across the industry, especially with AAA developers, is they have had their staff sizes bloated in the past decade to ridiculous degrees. Consider studios such as Bethesda and BioWare. I've discussed this before on the channel. Both of those studios have grown in size to the point where they used to be only about 100 people for a sustained period of time over the previous decade. In the last decade, both of those have now bloated to the point where they're over 800 strong employees. And I think a lot of people in general would regard their output over the past few years as being worse than it was before. You also have to take into account the rate of speed at which games were coming out a decade or even 2 decades ago compared to how slowly they come out now. This all feeds into those development costs. And not all of that is bug squashing and streamlining the games and everything else. No, the real problem is that every game now feels like it has to be the biggest, the most whatever, like you can't, it goes across the board. A fighting game now has to have more fighters than it ever had. An open world game now has to be bigger than it ever was before. An action game now has to have more levels than ever before. Any sort of procedurally generated game has to be played for hundreds and hundreds of hours, otherwise it's just a waste of time. Now, this even ties in directly to the game you see on the screen, and in particular, this section of the game. This is a linear, single-player game from Naughty Dog. Of course, Last of Us 2 just came out. Everyone's talking about it. I've been talking about it a lot. This entire chapter is entirely unnecessary to the game. They could have told what happens in this part of the story back in Seattle, and they wouldn't have had to build all these extra assets. They wouldn't have had to build a new set of architecture for the new building styles. They wouldn't have had to have new enemy types or the new faction, all the concept art and stuff that goes into that. They wouldn't have had to create Fat Geralt. They wouldn't have needed to do all that. Instead, they assumed that extra development time, the extra development cost. Naughty Dog took a lot more time on this game than their previous games. That's just a fact. Consider, in the past decade, again, Naughty Dog, another developer that has swelled in development size to the point where they're now over 400 people at the studio. And back 10 years ago, they were creating Uncharted 1, Uncharted 2, Uncharted 3. All of those games came out within 4 years of each other. Do you know that? 2007 to 2011, all three of those games came out. And now we have a much longer development cycle, basically double the time for the development cycle for The Last of Us Part 2, and it's an unnecessarily long game. They could have told this story in really half the time, and they didn't need to add on all the extra development time to create these extra assets. That's on them. So the notion that everything is unsustainable, well, publishers, you got to reel in these developers a little bit. This goes across the board for every type of game, like I was just saying. Consider Ubisoft on the last Assassin's Creed game used well over 1,000 people on the project. I believe I read it was about 1,400 people worked on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and a similar size group is working on the next game that's coming out this year. That's not necessary. No, but consider again, go back 10 years ago. Assassin's Creed 2 was well regarded, and people will still talk about Assassin's Creed 2 as one of their favorite Assassin's Creed games. Did the franchise need to blow up to the point where every game is going to take you more than 100 hours to play through everything? I mean, some people really like that. Some people only buy a few games a year. Yeah, they want the really long experience. But not everybody does. And the shorter games were satisfying the audience for a very long time. It just that the franchise got a little bit stale. But I don't think people were saying, hey, why don't you triple the length of the game? And that will fix everything. I don't really think that it does. Now, this is really an issue that popped up, as far as I'm concerned, with the massive success that Skyrim had. And all of a sudden, everyone felt like they had to make an open world game that took about 100 hours to beat. And this is where a lot of the bloat has started to come from. And my thinking is, more focused games that take maybe between 30 to 50 hours if for an open world game, and maybe a linear story doesn't take 25 to 30 hours to get through, I mean, maybe we need to go back to that. If you want to reel in development cost, the scope of the game matters a lot. The fact that we have development teams, such as BioWare, saying that they were laboring on Anthem for years without even really knowing or focusing on what they were trying to do until 18 months before the game came out. And you want to sit there and the industry just wants to whine and cry about development costs. Get your teams in line. Manage them properly. They talk about crunch all the time, and yeah, crunch is an issue, but if they're crunching and it's still taking them all of this time and the games are still coming out with a complete lack of focus, well, what are we doing here? I'm sure if you actually had... So there's a lot of games that just... after I play through them, I'm just like, wow, pretty good game, but they really could have used an editor because you could have slashed 30% of that game out. It wouldn't have mattered a bit. And this happens to me constantly when I'm playing a game. I'm like, why is this part in the game? It's totally unnecessary fluff. People talk about filler all the time because it's a major factor. And it doesn't help the player's experience when it's just nonsense filler content. Nobody wants that. And when they're talking about how in the next generation, development costs, it goes up every generation. Well, that's the problem with the scopes of the game. And I was looking back and I'm thinking, are games now really that much better than they were 10 years ago? I don't think so. Consider back over a decade ago, we were getting games like BioShock 1, which many people still consider to be one of the best games of all time, that hasn't been topped for a lot of people. We were getting games like Red Dead Redemption 1, which many people loved. Now Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, and yeah, there's a lot of that game that you can really respect, but it's also a game that's twice as long, at least, maybe even more than twice as long as the original game. Does it need to be? Really? Everyone loved the first one. It got people excited to buy the second one because of how much they liked the first game. It got a lot of buzz. It's well regarded, well respected, sold millions and millions and millions of copies. So did the sequel need to be 2 to 3 times as long? Probably not. And that just leads to longer development time. And again, with the time comes the cost. The biggest part of the cost for developing a game goes into the salaries. And it's just not necessary. You don't need 800 people working on a game. Consider this. One of my favorite games of the entire decade is a game called Dead Cells, which they just announced. The developers, Evil Empire, just announced that it sold over 3 million copies. Pretty good for an indie game that only 11 people work at the studio. And that's a game that I've put at least probably 100 hours into. But that's because it's got a lot of replayability, and it's a very tight and focused game. Similar to another game that I play all the time, Frostpunk. A very focused game made by just a handful of people. And it sold a ton of copies. You don't need to have 100-hour games. And I understand the difference between indie and AAA, and a lot of people do want that big AAA game. I get that. But it's all about the game's scope. Consider this. Next generation, inevitably, probably within the next 18 months, we'll get an announcement for The Division 3. Is that game going to be substantially different than The Division 2? Probably not. Probably similar scope, similar size, everything else. But somehow, we're led to believe that just because it's a new generation, that the development costs are just going to double. So now we have to foot the extra bill for the price increase. Now, obviously, there's arguments to be made for inflation and everything else, but I've gone through that in different videos before about how the industry has sustained itself through the reduction of physical sales and the move into digital sales, where they recoup a lot more profit than they were getting back with the original brick-and-mortar model. So I'm not going to get into that in this video necessarily. But the fact of the matter is that the games in the next generation aren't going to be terribly different. And they're probably not going to be terribly better. Faster loading times, yeah, that's coming with the hardware. I don't see how that's going to lead to increased development time when the consoles are supposed to be easier to develop for. That's counterintuitive and contradicts everything that we've been told up to this point. Before we heard about this price increase, everything we've heard coming from developers is, oh, PS5 would have dreamed to develop for. And people are even saying, I mean, the Xbox is apparently much easier to develop for too, but people have really been talking about, oh, PS5, just talking about how great it is to develop for. We keep hearing that. We've been hearing that for months. But now when it's time to increase the prices, oh, the burden of development, for the next generation, it's going to be so much worse. I'm sorry. Both of these things can't be true. Now, I would be actually okay with a $10 flat price increase probably across the board if you're really telling me that it's necessary. But unlike the movie industry, the gaming industry doesn't want to ever open the books. We never actually know. We hear about the total revenue, and this is a great way to get an extra 17% revenue as a baseline product. You jack it up by 10 bucks a piece, 17% profit right there, or revenue rather. It's right off the bat. But the problem is it's not just going to be this flat increase. We're still going to see this ridiculous monetization, regardless of what's going on in the UK with the loot boxes. That's not going to necessarily affect anything that happens in North America or Asia, because those markets are a lot more locked down as far as, the industry just being able to pressure the politicians. In the UK, in some countries in Europe, they had a little bit more leeway than we're going to see, I think, here in North America. But that's another part of the problem here. It's all about the monetization at the end of the day. And it's all about absorbing as much money as possible. But I just want people to not lose focus on the fact that this is really a problem that the industry has created for themselves. And if they really want to sit there and whine about development prices, they need to take a look in the mirror and stop trying to pass the buck on to the players. You really want to reel in the amount of money you're spending on development costs? How about you start slashing staff? And I know everyone's like, oh no, losing jobs? Well, I'm sorry. I've made this point before, and I know that everybody loses their minds when there's layoffs that happen. But I'm not saying that that you need to lay people off. You don't need to lay people off. I'm not talking about an overall loss of jobs. Shift people onto different products. You can have the same group, split the group in half, and have another group work on a separate IP, or even the same IP. If they're familiar with it, but have them work on a secondary game. You don't need to lay everybody off. I'm not talking about slashing jobs across the board. I'm talking about utilizing the assets you have in a better way. You do not need 1,400 people working on a game. I'm sorry. That's insane. Not when indie developers are proving time and time again that you can make worthwhile games with less than 1% of that. And again, I understand the scope is different and there's always going to be a group of people that want those really long games. But I'm sorry, you cannot tell me that you can justify having... Ubisoft uses like 4, 5, 6 worldwide studios on every one of their major games. That's insane. And I know that some of them are specialization studios, and that's a little bit different. But still, you cannot tell me that you need that many people to work on a project. And that's where all of your development cost is coming from. So stop whining, industry. You made this bed. You can lie in it. Stop trying to change the focus and act like it's all about, oh, we've been letting you gamers get away with these prices for years, and now it's time, we have to. Our backs are up against the wall. Consider how every single one of the major AAA publishers are in relation to their market prices compared to what they were a decade ago. Yeah, I'm sure you're all in deep financial problems. All of them have grown exponentially in the last decade. Not just in employee size, but in overall revenue. I mean, that's just a fact. And they can't hide that. They can hide the development costs, but they can't hide the revenue because they have to report that. And that gets out. That stuff gets out. The earnings calls get out. Also factor in that they're constantly complaining about development costs when the marketing cost for these games is usually twice as much as the price of the actual development. They're doubling their cost when it comes to the marketing. And this goes into the fact that they start the marketing process 3, 4, 5 years out before the game's ever going to launch. Stop doing that. Guess what? You can save money on marketing if you don't market a product that isn't coming out for 3 years. I know. It's crazy. I must be some sort of budgetary genius. You don't need to market games that are 3 to 5 years away. There's some savings for you there too. I know this is revolutionary stuff. With all the people working on these games and the amount of think tank that must go on behind the scenes in these budget meetings, how people can't understand that they're wasting their money throwing $100 million at marketing a game is beyond me. So stop doing that. Stop making every game a 100-hour-long collectathon. Stop making every game, oh, it's the biggest map we've ever had. That's irrelevant. Make it good content. The size of the map doesn't really matter if the content is good. Stop having games where you have constantly 15 to 20 minute long cutscenes. How about that? Actually let us play a game. You can tell a story in a game without having 20 minutes of cutscenes. Or Kojima ending a game with almost 6 straight hours of cutscene with minimal gameplay in the middle. There's some development cost you could have saved right there. Trust me, I didn't need to be sitting on that beach for the last hour of the game. Didn't need to happen. There's so much you could talk about when it comes to the wasted money that publishers throw at games. But anyway, that's it for me, Coach Toolshed. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Please subscribe if you want to stay in tune with the channel headed forward. And as always, keep it turned to 11.